Your support of independent activist news has gotten us to 100 episodes. Thank you. Now more than ever, we need your continued support in order to stand up to the system that boldly makes a mockery of truth, knowledge, and information. To become a Patreon of our show, visit patreon.com/actout and keep us acting out for hundreds more. This week, it's our 100th episode. Cheers. So in honor of that, we are taking a look at the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and more importantly, taking a look at the parallels so that we might learn from history rather than repeat it. Next up, the difference between a strike and a day off, and finally, Kamau Franklin and the call to be ungovernable. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. And this is our 100th episode. Before we dive into this week's news, I want to take a minute to say thank you to everyone who got us here. From your generous donations via Patreon to your consistent viewing, sharing, and spreading of activist news, you inspire and drive this show. So thank you for all that you do that makes this show possible. Cheers. And now then, back to work. In honor of our 100th episode, I found it apt and also necessary to take a look back at some 100-year-old new old news that not only highlights the repetitive role of history, the oppressor versus the oppressed, but more importantly, what we can learn from the dissidents before us. 2017 marks the 100-year anniversary of the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution of 2017, that is, which, if you go by the Gregorian calendar as opposed to the Julian calendar, would actually be called the November Revolution, but hey, let's not get stuck splitting hairs. A little bit of backstory here. The first iteration of Russian Revolution actually came more than a decade earlier in January 1905, when some 200,000 Russian citizens, fed up with war and inequality, marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to deliver a petition to Tsar Nicholas II, hoping to sway him towards reform. The petition was never delivered. The imperial guards opened fire on the crowd of peaceful protesters and killed hundreds of men, women, and children. Bloody Sunday, as it is commonly referred to, prompted waves of strikes and protests throughout Russia. The Tsar, as despots are wont to do, made a lame attempt at appeasement by creating a state Duma in 1906, essentially a legislative body elected by the people, tasked with taking up the concerns of the people, and supposedly endowed with oversight powers. However, the Tsar, again as despots are wont to do, made sure that he retained ultimate power in the form of a final veto, the ability to dissolve the Duma anytime he pleased, plus the added hurdle of the State Council, a noble, stacked, and half-Tsar-appointed body that oversaw the Duma and had final say on any legislation that they hoped to pass. While the first and second Dumas included leftist factions, not least of all the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, of which Lenin's Bolsheviks were a part, subsequent Dumas fell victim to the Tsar's autocratic powers, ensuring that businessmen, gentry, and landowners won the majority of seats, thanks to Tsar Nicholas's decree that gifted greater electoral value to each vote for a landowner versus a lesser value to each vote that went to misled members of the peasantry. Kind of like today's fractional voting. Because, fuck poor people. Needless to say, the Dumas were unsuccessful in reforming Russia's autocratic nightmare, which brings us up to just about 100 years ago. In March of 1917, February on their calendar, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated following an incident where the Tsar's order to fire upon protesters in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, literally backfired when some 60,000 soldiers ultimately joined the activists, taking over the city and torching government buildings and offices. Of course, this was just one of many riots and strikes that broke out over perpetual corruption and the dire lack of food, most notably caused by Russia's role in the First World War, something neither the economy nor the people supported. Following the Tsar's abdication, the provisional government that took power, made up of members from the last Duma and led by Alexander Kerensky, was useless, but well-intentioned at best. Although it managed to pass initiatives such as political freedom and freedom of the press, it foolishly chose to further Russia's role in World War I. Ironically, much thanks to the newfound freedom of the press, the Bolsheviks and Lenin's call for peace, land, and bread became far-reaching and far more appealing than more war under a half-assed government that, due to its splintered structure, couldn't effectively govern anyway. Fast forward to November, or late October in the Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks staged a coup, a surprisingly bloodless one, after which Lenin and the Bolsheviks officially ruled Russia. Now, even if I dedicated several shows to the events of the Russian Revolution, I would miss out on key details that are necessary to really define and therefore analyze the outcome and subsequent fucked-uppery of communist Russia. That being said, here's a brief rundown on what went wrong, what came to pass under the Bolsheviks. Dissenting socialists, anarchists, and activists outside the party were shot or imprisoned. Soviets, which essentially refers to local or district councils, were forced under the yoke of Lenin, Trotsky, and the party. Lenin himself wrote in late 1917, "We passed from workers' control to the creation of the Supreme Council of National Economy." In other words, the entire concept of socialism, which Lenin had stood on the barricades for, the main goal of a government and economy run by the workers, fizzled very soon after it was promised. Defenders of Bolsheviks and Lenin will say that the situation in Russia in 1917 was hardly ideal, with millions starving and a shattered economy. The argument is that although Lenin believed in this workers' paradise, Russia's then-present socioeconomic shitstorm made the manifestation of those ideas impossible, requiring not only, according to Marx's communist evolution, a push to first build capitalism before getting to socialism, but also requiring a more strict hierarchical and centralized command. No autonomous Soviets with flat structures, despite the fact that many workers were already manifesting such situations. But can we really blame Lenin? Did the circumstances of the place and time really disallow his promises to be fulfilled? As outlined in a 1970 essay in the UK socialist magazine Solidarity, the disorganization created by the war and by the resistance of the employing class, manifested as sabotage or desertion of their enterprises, clearly made it imperative to minimize and, if possible, eliminate unnecessary struggles between factory committees, such as struggles for scanty fuel or raw materials. There was clearly a need to coordinate the activity of the committees on a vast scale. The point at issue is not that a functional differentiation was found necessary between the various organs of working class power, such as Soviets, factory committees, etc., or that a definition was sought as to what were local tasks and what were regional or national tasks. The important thing is that a hierarchical pattern of differentiation was externally elaborated and imposed by an agency other than the producers themselves. In other words, yes, we can blame Lenin. Lenin and the party became the establishment that they had worked so hard to overthrow. The workers did not govern, nor did they have control over their own means of production. Points that could and should have been primary regardless of the socioeconomic situation, which, by the way, didn't come out of nowhere, but was one that Lenin and the party were well aware of during their campaigns, indeed since the early 1900s. Fast forward to the death of Lenin in 1924 and Stalin's rise to power, and we all have a pretty good idea of whether or not the party ever fulfilled their promise of a just and equal society. And let me take this moment to make the distinction between the execution of ideas and the ideas themselves. The incredible and tireless work of many activists in the Russian Revolution should serve as inspiration and beacons of hope. Our flat understanding of the Russian Revolution in this country leaves out the powerful statements and work of dissidents who risked and gave their lives for the dream of equality and justice. And perhaps most importantly, it leaves out the strong parallels to our struggles today. Indeed, even as Lenin put it before his unprincipled shift, capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. Or how about this quote? Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich, that is the democracy of capitalist society. It's almost as if he plagiarized this shit from a Truth Out article or something. These same beasts of empire and capitalism haunt us today, 100 years later. We're on the same barricades. And in order to remove ourselves from this perpetual loop of oppressors and oppressed, we have to learn the lessons etched on these age-old barricades. We have to learn that we can't hope for reform from the oligarchs, the autocrats, the despots. Appealing to the Tsar, it didn't work. Lining up to vote for a powerless Duma rigged for the nobility didn't work. Hell, appealing to King Louis XVI of France didn't work either, even though the French citizens did try many times. In that same vein, know when your tight hold of an ideology becomes a stranglehold on the very people that you had hoped it would help. For example, Lenin believed that because Russia was so technologically and indeed economically behind the rest of the Western world, that Russia would first have to work on bolstering capitalism before evolving to socialism under the Marxist theory of communist evolution. Trotsky argued otherwise, suggesting that Russia did not need to build up capitalism first in order to attain a socialist structure. Now there are pros and cons in both perspectives. Basically, read political analysis and study, but don't cling to any projected path to utopia, because guess what? That shit never works out in practice, only in theory. Ideologies by definition and in the interest of self-preservation do not and cannot bend to the change in circumstances. We have to be ideologically anarchical. Don't prescribe to any one ism. You will find yourself tied to it, hoping for a buoy as it sinks. And finally, as Nietzsche put it, beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. In the realm of politics, there will always be a reason why you just had to skip out on that promise. The times were just too tough and you didn't have the power to, blah, blah, blah. But as one anarchist blogger put it in their analysis of the Russian Revolution, ultimately, if difficult times back in 1918 to 21 justified suppressing working class freedom and self-management, imprisoning and shooting anarchists and other socialists, implementing and glorifying party dictatorship, what might we expect in difficult times in the future? This slippery slope is the creator of monsters. Just ask the Democrats. So don't try to reform the unreformable. Understand your place and time. Don't cling to ideologies, and careful lest you revolutionaries become the monsters that you're fighting. In honor of all the dedicated activists from 100 years ago to 100 episodes ago to today, to the front lines, to the fight. Now, in the spirit of fighting on, let's talk strikes, or something like a strike. This Friday, February 17th, organizers are calling on everyone to leave work, school, and the shopping for a full day. Now, while I'm a big fan of the general strike as a powerful tactic, I do feel that the February 17th organizers are organizing more of a day off work than an actual strike. What's the difference? Well, a day off work is a day off work. A general strike is a work stoppage organized by and for workers in order to draw attention to and change unacceptable aspects of their work life and environment. It could be a day, it could be several weeks, and there is always risk attached. Risk of losing your job, risk of coming face to face with the pawns of the empire, police, or indeed National Guard, a la the Hormel strike in 1984-85. But in a general strike, workers choose to accept this risk because the risk is deemed better than the status quo. Therefore, the list of demands is always coherent and direct. There's no place for vague suggestion when you're putting your body on the line. The strike on February 17th lists two demands on their site. namely a demand for senators and representatives to 1. Reaffirm your oath of office and unbounded compliance with the Constitution of the United States of America on or before February 17th, the day of the general national strike, and 2. Actively oppose any governmental language or action that violates any tenet of our Constitution. Okay, but what does that mean to us? To our daily lives and the fight for justice? The Constitution makes no mention of the fight for 15. It makes no mention of fossil fuel projects that destroy people and planet for profit. It makes no mention of a woman's right to control her own body or receive equal pay for equal work. It makes no mention of the school-to-prison pipeline or a horrifically racist injustice system. I mean, fuck, why would it? That shit was written by white slave-owning men. There's no mention of a Muslim ban or the perpetual wars fought against enemies that we've created through our bombing campaigns. Any one of these, placed in a strike's list of demands, would make a far more pointed statement than just asking members of Congress to, I guess, keep being members of Congress? Not to mention that the site makes it clear that the only people who should engage in the strike are those who can afford to do so. And as Alex Gorovich pointed out in Portside last week, this must be the first time someone called for a general strike but exempted most of the working class. A general strike without clear demands that targets only those with the privilege to take a day off of work or school is not a general strike. That's a day off. It's a 3-day weekend with a political hashtag. And again, this is not to shit on the idea of a general strike, quite the opposite. This is a side-eye critique of comfortable actions that make a stronger point on their websites than they do in the streets. It's a critique of events that are more feel-good than do-good. It's a reminder that big days of action are pointless unless they are bolstered by community building, organizing, and the inclusive and intersectional work of solidarity that is required right now. As Gorovich writes in that same article, even moderately effective general strikes don't emerge willy-nilly like miraculous interventions into national life. They are intensifications and radicalizations of already existing patterns of resistance by the working class. This demand for a general strike looks less like that intensification and more like an attempt to leapfrog all the hard, long-term political work that goes before. We have a lot of work to do. And right now, that is far more important than calling for a few thousand members of the middle class to take a day off work. So if you can, I say do still take the 17th off of work, but take that time to build in your community. Something that, to be fair, the Strike 17 website does mention. But take that time to get uncomfortable, because getting uncomfortable is how we make change, and becoming ungovernable is how we pave the way. And with that in mind, I'd like to shift now to Kamau Franklin, lawyer, journalist, and community organizer. One of his latest endeavors is simply and pointedly called Ungovernable. Last week, he sat down with us to discuss what it means and what it takes to be ungovernable, the importance of building as we fight, and what we can and need to do now. Take a look.
It's important to do short-term protests, short-term action, short-term civil disobedience, and more, because we need to create space to show that there's going to be an active resistance. And I think everybody recognizes this, that there's going to be an active resistance against the policies and measures that this particular administration is going to put in. But we don't just want to fall back into a pattern of, oh, if the Democrats win again, then everything's fine. So we know that in order to use this time period wisely, that we have to build alternative structures that give people ways in which we can start thinking about how do we create alternative food sources, right? How do we create even alternative ways to defend ourselves, people have been talking about. How do we create alternative parties that really represent our values and views? And there's a litany of other things.
And with that, what you said about building alternative parties as well, it seems clear that Ungovernable and other organizations are not expecting the Democrats to be the saviors here. Talk about this idea of the left needing to divorce itself from the Democratic Party in order to really not only affect change, but mount a legitimate opposition to the entire system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Democratic Party operates to keep the left in the liberal party system, right? So I think it tries to scare us around how far the right wing can go. but it doesn't really offer us any alternative that's different or so different that we think is going to change our lives. I think it's a strategy to suggest that, you may run people on a Democratic Party ticket every now and then because that's what people recognize until we do the hard work of changing people's minds and saying, well, look, we've tried that route and maybe there's some different routes that we can take. I think there's some parties out there that are options for people to look at, but I also think some of the conversations that at least we're having is that people are thinking about creating new vehicles that they think are not necessarily interested strictly in every 4 years running someone for president, but are really interested in some of that grassroots organizing that has like its candidates to come out of that process that they can run particularly on local levels and then maybe work your way up to something bigger. But we definitely think that local level political action is something that needs to be done that's teamed up with the national apparatus.
So with that, also talk about either you personally or Ungovernable. Do you see sort of this idea of working within the system, either, like you said, perhaps sometimes running somebody on a Democratic ticket as a real progressive, or do you see that the focus really needs to shift from trying to work within the system and just focus on building these communities? Is it a little bit of both?
I think there's a clear shift away from the parties, but I think that takes time. I think just because we're there, we haven't brought over enough people to say, like, yes, we agree completely with that. I think the strategy that the left sometimes, one step too far, if we don't bring anybody with us, then we're alone talking to each other. So we have to build a base of people. And I think that's one of the critiques that, and I think rightfully so, some people I know who've done a lot of work, particularly in the South around issues of civil rights and human rights, was that folks who spent a lot of time critiquing Hillary, and I agree that she needed to be critiqued, were not prepared for the alternative onslaught because they themselves did not do the groundwork necessary to prepare people for battling or for organizing in a different way.
Talk about how left organizations need to focus more on this community building aspect that they just sort of use as lip service while still working inside the system to the extent that they are so easily appeased.
No, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. One of the problems with the left is that this nonprofit structure, this nonprofit industrial complex, as people call it, has really taken over left organizing. Whereas people would organize around many issues, right? Now we've siloed ourselves, one. Two, we've become so dependent on a fundraising apparatus that goes to donors, that goes to foundations, and the foundations then set the agenda for what it is that we're allowed to talk about and not talk about. And even for those who think that they're pretty left, when they do demonstrations and activities against the Trump administration, they couch it within a certain language which makes liberal types or progressive types comfortable. And again, I believe you have to bring people over, but I also believe that you can only do that by making people a little uncomfortable and making them think about the positions that they have. And that's always the challenge, is that the Democrats and these liberal organizations, their real goal is to hold America together as is, except for them to be in charge. And this incremental thinking around change is what they're comfortable with. If we don't break away from that, and we only look at that as the way in which we will fight, and we will always be left in this position of having left forces co-opted.
Yeah, and it's that idea of an ungovernable, like, assumes that you're not going to ask permission, you're not going to ask the corrupt to be less corrupt, because what is the actual point of that? And with that idea of being uncomfortable, talk about how people can then be ungovernable in their daily lives, and what do we need to change, and what do we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable? Like, how do we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable, and is that a necessary part of this ungovernable path?
It's a necessary part. It's the hard part. It's the part that takes real organizing and activism and folks who are willing to struggle together. I think one of our problems on the left is that we're ready to split in 2 seconds when we have different ideological views about something that probably doesn't matter except for another 20 years down the line. So I think one of the things that we have to do is sit in a room with each other and start planning and organizing. And it's not that hard these days. I think, again, the liberal apparatus has co-opted even things around sustainable food development, right? So now you can do sustainable food. I think back at the Panthers and the free breakfast programs, the political nature of it, right? It wasn't just about free breakfast. It was a way to reach people, to talk to people around what the system did not provide and could not provide and was not willing to, I should not say could not provide, but was not willing to provide. Once the system got a hold of that, they took the politics out of it and still and gave some version of it, right? But they took the politics out of it, which made it safe. I think organizing within a community to do cop watches is something that people talk about. It may not, these become model programs that we can sort of think about how we can expand them in the future. But these days, you don't even have to buy cameras. You have cell phones, right? So we can think about how do we organize those things? How do we develop alternative ways to raise money and to get income coming in? Whether or not that's money that's coming in because people are paying dues to organizations and we're trying to sustain off of that, whether or not there's small business enterprises that we think about in terms of sustainable development. I think those are things that are easier to do and that we can do in small collectives and grow those small collectives. I think people are looking for those alternatives, and unless we start to develop them, they're going to lose hope in what the left can provide.
And with that, also talk about what you think is the ideal structure for this. There's been some talk about using a hierarchy that's similar to what the system uses is not going to work because the system is based on this sort of oppressor versus the oppressed versus the sort of flat structure. What do you think is best when people go to this community building?
Okay. I think a collective structure is best. One that people have an opportunity to have a voice, when people have an opportunity to say yay or nay. I do think you have, you try to make sure that you bring as many people along as possible. And then people get assignments. The best leaders to me are people who follow until it's their time to lead.
So finally, talk about what's next for Ungovernable. I know that you did a lot of actions across the nation for January 20th. What are you planning now?
I think we're going to continue with some action. So we just finished discussing doing something on May 1st. And so we're going to put out some information on that as another day in which we can collectively work to put out a strong message of resistance to what's happening. I think we're going to continue to participate in local actions and large actions as they happen. I think as a lot of people are doing. But I think what we're really going to do is start to shift. And what we have done is start to have these conversations around what alternative institutions look like. So via the summer, we're going to have a larger gathering of folks to come together and really share information and start planning around what that looks like.
For more on Ungovernable and to take the pledge to be ungovernable, visit Ungovernable2017.com. And that, revolutionaries, will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for getting us to 100 episodes. Here's to hundreds more. As always, please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide to see all the sites mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.